So first of all, I wanted to thank you, Judy, for inviting me tonight. It's been hard to get excited about much lately, but I do get excited about shellfish. So it's a pleasure to join you here tonight. Again, for those of you who I haven't had the pleasure of meeting, my name is Tessa Getchis, and I'm an extension specialist with the Connecticut Sea Grant Program and Yukon Extension. I also grew up fishing and shellfishing here in southeastern Connecticut. And from early on, just a little bit of history about me. My dad had me hooked on the ocean, and he also had me intrigued when he talked about how much it was changing way back then. 30 years ago, we were talking about bait fish and eelgrass and how they were disappearing, and I was just trying to comprehend what he already understood. And now it's about how our favorite clamming area is closed more frequently because of rainfall and runoff, although not this year because we've had quite a drought. But these are complex issues that affect not only the harvesters and the farmers that I work with today, but all of us in some way. What we're doing on land is really having an impact on our coastal waters. And if you were able to participate in the first two seminars in the series, you heard about some of the key water quality challenges in our region and what's being done to better understand and protect our coastal waters. In tonight's presentation, we'll talk about bivalve shellfish and their habitats and what we call the ecosystem services they provide, what's happened to shellfish populations throughout time, and how land use-based decisions are affecting them. And I'll end with some ideas on what we can do to minimize our impact and talk a little bit about some innovative community efforts that we're using shellfish to improve water quality. In Long Island Sound, we have many species of shellfish that are commercially, recreationally, and ecologically important. Those that we'll focus on tonight are the bivalves, which have two shells that enclose their soft bodies. Oysters, clams, scallops, and mussels are all bivalves, and there are many different species within those groups. They're present throughout the Sound, but they each inhabit unique environments. Some, like the oysters and mussels, prefer stable bottoms and need shell or other hard surfaces to complete their life cycle. But the clams, they're burrowing bivalves, and they're usually found in more silty or sandy areas for the most part. And scallops usually start their life cycle attached to eelgrass or other types of algae, and then later become free-living. And most bivalves, with a few exceptions, follow this general life cycle. The females produce large numbers of tiny eggs that are fertilized in the water column, and within days, they transform into floating larvae. And weeks later, they begin to build their shell. This typically happens with most shellfish during the warm summer months. As the water temperatures are rising, they're triggered to reproduce. So these baby shellfish eventually settle, and they dig into the bottom in the case of clams, or they attach to these hard surfaces, as with oysters, mussels, and scallops. And some of them can reproduce as early as the next season. And oysters and mussels especially tend to form these expansive reefs as they grow and reproduce more shellfish that then replenish the reef. Bivalve shellfish provide what we call ecosystem services. And in the next few slides, what I want to do is describe the services and why they're so valuable to us. In intact marsh systems like this one with ribbed marsh mussels are an important habitat. This type of marsh will filter the water flowing from the land, but it also provides a protective barrier against storm surges and coastal erosion. And the mussels and the tiny threads that hold them together within the marsh are key to this protective mechanism. This natural oyster bed is actually in the town of Fairfield, Connecticut, and there's restoration work now in progress. It didn't always look this way. At one time, there were a lot more oysters in the area, and hopefully in the future there will be again, but there has been some progress. These types of oyster beds in coastal areas, whether they're in shallow subtidal areas or even in intertidal areas, can significantly reduce wave heights and wave energy. And by reducing that energy flow along the shoreline, they can protect and minimize coastal erosion. Shellfish beds also provide habitat for other marine organisms. Many types of fish and invertebrates use shellfish beds for homes, foraging, and reproductive areas, and also protection from predators. And diving and wading birds also use them for feeding grounds, and all sorts of animals. And if we lose this habitat, we also lose the animals that are dependent on it. These photos are from a recent and ongoing project. In areas across Long Island Sound, NOAA scientists from the Milford Laboratory have been working to document how marine animals utilize both natural shellfish areas as well as cultivated or farmed shellfish areas where there are gear that are in place holding oysters or clams or scallops. And what they've found is that fish congregating around shellfish aquaculture gear are very diverse and very abundant, and in some cases as much as on natural reefs. Now, that doesn't mean the habitat value is the same because, of course, with shellfish farming, there's disturbance throughout the year. But it's interesting that the animals are utilizing these farming structures as they would a natural reef. And it's been really fun to see some of the videos and still shots that have been coming out of these areas, different areas throughout the Sound and within different seasons. And of course, one of the key characteristics of bivalve shellfish is that they're filter feeders. They can filter many gallons of water a day, depending on the species, their size, and the temperature of water. So throughout the year, as the water is warming up, shellfish are more actively pumping, which means they're filter feeding quicker. And as temperatures slow, their metabolism slows down, so they're filtering at a lot slower rate, and so fewer gallons of water per day. And as they're filtering the water, they're also sorting through food and unwanted particles, things they don't want to eat, sand, silt. And there are burrowing species like the clams that use siphons to access their food. And the siphons act as like a straw that helps them draw water into their body and then to get rid of undigested particles and waste. And these are some of the images. On the left is an enlarged image of a northern quahog clam siphon. And the image in the middle is just showing it actually in the sediment. So they have an inhalant siphon where the water is drawn in and the exhalant siphon where the water is ejected out in any waste. And you can see on the right are a whole bunch of small clams that are sitting just below the surface before I eat them. And because oysters live on the bottom rather than in it, they don't rely on siphons, but create a current of water that flows over these feather-like gills that they have. The gills sort food and absorb oxygen, and then these tiny hair called cilia transport the uneaten particles and waste out of the shell. And the waste just becomes food for scavengers, or bacteria break it down. Both silt and plankton are removed from the water as they feed, and in this way, the appearance of the water can become clear. So when we say shellfish contribute to clearer water, this is why. The clearer water is actually a good thing since it allows more sunlight to penetrate, which then aids in the growth of seagrasses if they're native and increases dissolved oxygen that's available. Shellfish also play a key role in the cycling of nitrogen in coastal waters as they feed on phytoplankton, which use nitrogen from the water to grow. So in the process of feeding that you just saw in that last shot, they're removing the algae from the water, and in doing so, they're taking the nitrogen, they're converting it into another form. They use nitrogen to build body tissue, and when they release undigested food and waste, bacteria convert that form of nitrogenous waste into a non-toxic form. So this is a really important ecosystem service, especially in coastal waters that have an excess nutrient problem. And so, Judy, you brought up the slide with the little Narragansett Bay, and I know that Maura's really interested and has been working in Baker Cove and Groton, areas where we have nutrient issues. And so having more shellfish in these waters is really key, but the question is how much shellfish, and are there other issues that are preventing shellfish from thriving in those places to begin with? And the answer in some cases is yes. And lest I forget to mention that shellfish harvest is an important part of our history here in Connecticut. This is a slide that I like to show. I have a whole bunch of these from Mystic Seaport collections, and this is commercial harvesters digging clams in the Mystic River in the 1800s. And there are so many amazing slides showing our history of recreational and commercial harvest throughout the state. And it's just part of our culture, and that it's for sure part of our history, but also of our future. Shellfish were, of course, a seasonal source of food for Native Americans and became a staple for early colonists. And today we have a lot of businesses that are farming them, which is pretty exciting. So aquaculture, or shellfish farming, has become our primary source in Connecticut of shellfish products. Connecticut industry employs more than 300 people, and it's almost a $30 million business. That's just the farm gate revenue from sales. The state earns more than $700,000 in revenues from industry members who lease areas to plant and cultivate their shellfish. So they're basically renting space in Long Island Sound and its tributaries as farms. And there's a huge multiplier effect to the state economy from the purchase of boats, equipment, and shellfish seed, and all sorts of other things that are needed for this farming process. And of course, we also benefit from having a fresh supply of local seafood. Shellfish also provide plenty of recreational harvest opportunity for residents in Connecticut and also out-of-state residents or out-of-state visitors. Most of our coastal towns offer a permit for a small fee that allows us to collect these bivalves for personal consumption. And the sale of these permits generate over $100,000 annually. The activities are so important that each town has a shellfish commission that monitors water quality in collaboration with a dedicated state agency that manages shell fisheries. Commercial and recreational harvests are, of course, highly dependent on clean water. And so those shellfish commissions in the state have a huge responsibility to monitor the water quality, to analyze samples, to report back to towns, to open and close areas, and also to better understand the challenges along our shorelines so that areas can be hopefully upgraded if they're not currently approved for harvest, or in worst case scenario, downgraded because there is a pollution source. And so many of our towns in southeastern Connecticut have faced challenges like this, where some sort of source of pollution has been identified. And the towns have worked very diligently to not only identify the problem, but find funds to correct it, so that these shellfish areas can be upgraded or reopened. So a really important group of folks that are working to help ensure that we have seafood harvest. And so just to give you an idea of where this happens, just in our, my town of Stonington that I live in, this is Stonington, and just to the west, Groton. All these different colored shapes in the water represent the various recreational and commercial shellfishing areas. There are hundreds of acres just in this part of the state that are dedicated to shellfishing, and tens of thousands of acres statewide. It's a huge resource. There are also more than 7,000 acres of natural oyster beds. Those are generally in the central and western part of the state. So we have a lot of shellfish and shell fisheries activities here in Connecticut. But was that always the case? The truth is that we're nowhere near the level of historic shellfish populations. So I want to transition to how we got where we are now. Overfishing is something that everybody points to, but that was sort of a long time ago. Overfishing in the 18th and 19th centuries drastically reduced our shellfish populations along the entire East Coast, not just here in Connecticut. But it was really development of our shorelines that had the biggest impact after overfishing. That's really what changed how our shellfish beds function. There are other problems that affect our shellfish populations: siltation, disease, predation, storms. These all happen on a regular basis, but shellfish beds could recover if they were in a natural state, but we really altered our shoreline. And so I want to give you a few examples of this and compare New Haven Harbor, considered at one time to be the center of the world's oyster industry to the present day. So this is the harbor 100 years ago. What you'd see all along the coastline were basically oyster businesses. They were shucking plants, packing plants, and rail lines basically to distribute the product across the country. And on the right, what you'll see is a picture of the harbor, excuse me. And all of those little boxes are hundreds of individual oyster farms. And that's really why it was the mecca of oyster farming in the day. It was very productive. We had these huge natural beds, which do still exist today and provide oyster seed for the industry. But those beds were sustaining the industry. So shellfishermen were actually going to the beds and harvesting small oyster seeds and then planting them out on their own private grounds. And so those natural beds have sustained the industry for more than 100 years. Compare that though to New Haven Harbor of today. And I wish that you were on unmute right now so I could hear the we still have farming in New Haven. We still have shellfish farms, but many of the areas are closed to direct harvest because of land-based pollution sources. And so even where we do have some farming occurring, those shellfish have to be moved from these areas as small seed and then depurated out in approved areas. The depuration process is a natural process that allows the shellfish, while they're filter feeding, to purge any types of bacteria and viruses that they might pick up in waters that are polluted. And so in waters that are not polluted, as they're filter feeding, they can quickly purge those bacteria and they're diluted in the system, but it takes some time to do that. And the cities are an extreme, but even in suburban and rural areas, we've altered most of our coves and embayments along our shoreline. And these did support shellfish habitats and harvest a long time ago. By building roads and bridges and railroad trestles, we've essentially changed the freshwater and the tidal flow, and that's caused a lot of siltation in the edges of our coves and also erosion. And the incoming silt in some areas has effectively buried the shellfish beds faster than they can grow. So especially the reef-forming shellfish. You know, the clams that are burrowing, they can stick their siphons up and they can move up and down vertically. But the oysters and mussels, once they're in place, the only thing that they can do is reproduce and build that reef up. And they can't do that fast enough with all the silt that we have coming in and the lack of flushing that we have in these coves. It's a huge problem. But today, regulators do recognize the impact of the development and the changes that we've made. And with each new application for a dock or structure, they consider the potential impact on the shellfish beds. And the local state officials, those shellfish commissions and the state regulators that I mentioned before, have to sign off on any applications saying that there's no impact to the shellfish or the shellfisheries before those types of applications can move forward. So any of these marinas that you see, if they want to add another floating dock, or if someone wants to add a dock in front of their home or build a wall, all of these managers have to look at that application and make sure that there's no impact before any discussion can happen about the building of that structure. And that's really important that that's happening. But this is where we're at right now, at least with oysters. This figure shows the global condition of oyster reefs. This is from a publication from 2011, but it's still relevant. The condition assigned to each of these regions is based on the percentage of the current to historical abundance of oyster reefs remaining. So I want you to take a minute to look at this if you haven't seen it before. There's a little figure or legend on the left, the lower left. So the blue is good. And good means that these are reefs where less than 50% of the oysters have been lost. And you'll notice that there are very few blue areas. They're located in South America for the most part. Where 50 to 89% of them lost, those are considered fair, and those are the yellow areas. There are a lot more of those. Excuse me. 90 to 99% is considered poor if we've lost that many. And you'll see there are a lot of areas rated at poor. And the worst is what is considered functionally extinct. That's when 99% or more is lost. And when we eliminate oyster habitats, we also eliminate all of the ecosystem services and the economic benefits that they've provided. And so what you'll see is, along our coasts of North America, we've essentially lost between 90 and 99% of our historic oyster populations, and surely have lost similar amounts of other types of shellfish. But oyster reefs are so very important because of their reef-forming qualities and because of the benefits that that reef provides. But we're fortunate in Connecticut to still have some of the most extensive oyster beds in the United States. They're very unlike the beds that we see or have been aware of in the Chesapeake, where they form these nice pyramid shapes. We do have some shallow intertidal beds, like the one I showed you in Fairfield. We also have some very shallow subtidal beds. They're not exposed by the tides. A lot of those have been set aside for the purpose of aquaculture. And so oystermen are able to, again, as I mentioned before, at certain times of the year, they're allowed to harvest certain quantities. This is a highly regulated activity, but certain quantities of oysters and then plant those on their own cultivated beds. They never harvest all of the shellfish that are there. So they do provide, those beds do provide some habitat value. And there are also areas that are never harvested in town and state waters. So some of the beds are in good condition, but not all of them. And just this summer, a project was conducted to improve the condition of some of these beds in the western portion of the Sound. And I just wanted to show you a couple of images of what the habitat looked like. So on the left, this is a natural bed in Bridgeport, and you'll see that there's basically no shell on the bottom. I don't see any oysters, maybe a couple of shells, but there's a huge accumulation of silt. And so we have a lot of silt coming down the river with a lot of rainfall, and not a lot of flow over these areas. And we have oyster shell and oysters that have been buried, and not enough oysters reproducing so that they can build this reef or this bed fast enough. And so on the right was a project that engaged the aquaculture industry. And just a quick amount of background, a quick bit of background on this is that when the pandemic hit earlier this year, oystermen were out of work. The shellfish markets closed, and we were trying to work with the state to get them back working. And we had also been working with the state. The State Bureau of Aquaculture has been developing a shellfish restoration plan. And so they had some ideas about how they wanted to rehabilitate these beds already, but no funding to do so. And so we worked together to secure funding and put industry back to work to rehabilitate these beds. And so the image on the right is just a snapshot of one of those areas where the silt was removed, new shell was added, and broodstock were actually planted. So those large oysters that will reproduce in subsequent seasons. And as they do, they will help replenish this bed with new oysters. So hopefully we'll start to see some structure. And the state is considering different management options where they may be able to have sort of a rotating harvest where some areas are left untouched and others are harvested, so that we can increase the habitat value and the ecosystem services that that bed provides. And so now I want to transition from the importance of shellfish and what we've lost to the big issues that have gathered us here tonight. And that's really to talk about how land use decisions affect shellfish and shellfisheries. And stormwater runoff is the key challenge that introduces other problems that have been discussed in this series, like excess nitrogen and pathogens in our coastal waters. And we've already talked about the tremendous filtration capacity of shellfish, but it's also what allows them to accumulate pathogens that can cause foodborne illness. And to avoid this risk, regulators close shellfish harvest areas when bacteria counts are high. But this has its own implications. So there's lost revenue, and it's really inconvenient for those of us who are counting on a bucket of clams for dinner. Hint, hint. And when the areas have persistent pollution sources, they can be closed to harvest indefinitely. So that's a huge problem, not only for the environment, but again, for people who depend on these areas for their livelihoods. And excess nutrients don't affect how safe the shellfish are to eat, but too much nitrogen causes phytoplankton and seaweed blooms, which in turn can smother and kill shellfish beds. So they're just impacting shellfish in a different way. And so many of our local coves and bayments, such as this one in Quambog Cove in Stonington, used to support shellfishing. There were active shellfish farms. In the late 1800s in this cove, it was lined shore to shore with private harvest areas. And you see this in other coves in eastern Connecticut, and in fact, throughout Connecticut, they supported some sort of commercial harvest. But today, harvest is limited in many of our nearshore areas, especially the coves, due to the presence or potential for bacteria and viruses to be there. And the federal government assumes that we eat all shellfish raw. And so there's a huge risk to certain populations when you're consuming raw shellfish of getting a foodborne illness. But you can be sure that the shellfish you harvest is safe to eat if you are harvesting in an area that is classified as approved and if it's in the open status. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. A map of the approved harvest areas is issued with each permit, and each town has a hotline that provides the status of all areas. And they're also marked when you actually go walk along the shoreline to a harvest area or you're approaching with your boat. So how are these classifications established? The Connecticut Department of Agriculture's Bureau of Aquaculture establishes all of the harvest areas in the states and assigns them a classification to minimize the health risks that we talked about. And by doing this, they may restrict the harvest of shellfish in certain locations. So to establish an area or to maintain or upgrade a certain classification requires a shoreline survey, which is an extensive survey to identify any of the pollution sources along the coast. So for example, leaking pipes, septic systems, cesspools, and the environmental analysts from the Bureau actually walk along the shoreline periodically in every coastal town to do this. In some cases, when there's a wastewater treatment plant, they also conduct a hydrographic study, and that helps them to better understand the circulation patterns in the bacterial and viral load in these shellfish areas and how wastewater flow is diluted as it leaves the plant. And also there's prescribed water and shellfish meat sampling. And that is usually conducted by the environmental analysts in collaboration with our volunteer Shellfish Commission members and sometimes industry. So that group is really, really key. They use fecal coliform bacteria as an indicator of possible contamination because it's found in the waste of all warm-blooded animals. And it's also indicative of other potential pathogens that could make us sick. And so what they do is create a map like the one that you just saw, and I can toggle back this one here on the left that describes the status or classification of the area. And then in terms of the status, these signs on the right, these tell you whether the area is open or closed for harvest. So it's one thing to be approved for the harvest of shellfish, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily opened. It could be in a closed status due to rainfall or due to some sort of leaking pipe or whatever it may be. So you have to make sure you're actually working in an area that's classified as open, or excuse me, classified as approved or conditionally approved, and then that it's in the open status. And so this is a busy slide, but to keep it simple, I just focus on the top 3 areas or classifications, which are, if you look just underneath the orange bar, approved, conditionally approved seasonally, and conditionally approved. These are areas where direct harvest is allowed for recreational harvest or commercial harvest. All of these areas have a rainfall trigger, which is the amount of rain in a 24-hour period that warrants a closure due to the potential for bacterial contamination, and that's coming from runoff, of course, because it's raining. So these triggers are typically within the range of 1 to 2 inches, and it's based on a huge data set collected by a state environmental analyst. So when it rains, they're out sampling with the Shellfish Commissions, with industry, and they're out when it's raining in good conditions, bad conditions. They're sampling not only the water, but also shellfish meats. And they know what the background bacterial loads are, and that's how they classify the waters, but then they see how changes occur in adverse conditions. And so they also not only look at this in real time, but they look at these data sets and changes throughout time to better understand whether there's justification for an upgrade of an area or potentially a downgrade. So in some cases, water quality is improved over time. Someone has identified a pollution source and has addressed it. And so we can upgrade those areas with enough data. And in other cases, we're going the wrong way, and water quality has degraded to the point where the area has to be closed to harvest indefinitely. And that's a huge problem. And so this is another map that I put up for Maura. She's been working in Baker Cove, and let me just switch to this. As I mentioned, harvest is restricted in many of our nearshore areas, and the red shaded areas, this is the town of Groton, indicates that shellfishing is prohibited because of some sort of pollution source. Typically, not always. Sometimes there are administrative closures just because they can't get to sample in an area, but usually it's because there's some sort of pollution source. And again, Maura has been focused on reducing bacteria. She and her team have been working with stakeholders throughout the watershed to try to reopen the recreational shellfishing in Baker Cove if they can identify all the different sources of bacteria and then try to implement some measures to reduce that bacteria. And it's not a small challenge, but they're working on these strategies. So pinpointing non-point pollution in the community, which will in turn have a positive impact, not only on water quality, but shell fisheries. And Little Narragansett Bay, this is a location that Judy mentioned in Weekly-Quack Cove. This is another example of not only bacteria, but a nutrient problem. The nutrients enter the water from point sources like wastewater treatment plants, but they also come from direct runoff and storm drains. And these excess nutrients, mainly nitrogen, have created persistent blooms of microscopic phytoplankton, but also large algal mats, one species called Cladophora, which many of you are familiar with, and Jamie spoke about a couple of weeks ago. These have reduced water clarity and quality in the area, and in some cases have smothered shellfish beds. And when they do that, not only can the smothering affect shellfish beds and reduce the oxygen, but as that seaweed dies or the phytoplankton bloom dies, the bacteria that break down that bloom also consume the oxygen. And so it's just a huge environmental problem. And we're just trying to grapple with it now. And the nitrogen problem is certainly not unique to this region. Now, if there wasn't something we could do about this, it would be a pretty depressing evening. So next, I'm going to share some things that we as individuals can do and some strategies that communities are focusing on to clean up coastal waters and in turn protect shellfish and shell fisheries in the process. So keeping in mind that stormwater runoff is one of the key issues that we're facing, we can do our best to keep storm drains clear from trash and debris. And this is really difficult because we don't own our own individual storm drains. And I think that individuals don't feel that it's their responsibility, at least a lot of individuals. My neighbors definitely don't. And occasionally I'll walk by and get frustrated that there's a can thrown there or a can has floated down my street into the storm drain, but I don't pick it up because it's gross. And we really need to find a way to work towards better storm drain management. It's not just a community issue. It's really something in our neighborhoods that we have to take responsibility for, because it's one way we can really stop pollution from going directly out to the sea. We can also make sure that nutrient and pathogens don't end up in storm drains by properly disposing of pet waste, and also avoid washing our cars in our driveway. I know a lot of people do that, but it can become a problem. We have a lot of detergents, and you're changing your oil, or I'm changing my oil in my driveway. My husband's changing my oil. I don't do it. I don't like to do it, and he does. So, but these sorts of things, they don't stay in place. They always leak, and they're always going to end up in the storm drain. And I'm not the only one that does this in my driveway. Everybody is doing something that is leading out to the sea. And so everybody has to do something, pick one thing. And my job is just to provide you with some information tonight, and you take away and do what you can. Or if you're doing great things that aren't on this list, please share them, because the more we can do to convince everybody that they make an impact and that they can make a positive impact, the better off we'll be. But better yet, we can replace, let me back up. I was going to talk about fertilizer first. Fertilizer is also a huge issue. Whether you fertilize your garden or your lawn, that's a big problem too. And so we can reduce our dependence on fertilizers, or make sure we apply them just by the directions. Or better yet, we can replace our lawns with perennial gardens that don't need a lot of water and fertilizer. We can carve out certain areas, or maybe make a buffer along our property line in front of the storm drain, or in front of areas that water collects and pours over. And speaking of water, we can collect rainwater and use it to water gardens or lawns. That's a great way to conserve water and also prevent runoff from our roofs. All of us have a roof over our head and probably a driveway with a lot of impervious surface area where anything can just run out and down to the storm drain. And it will surely pick up contaminants along the way. And if we're in the mindset of that's constantly happening, then anything we can do to sort of keep that water off of those surfaces is important. So just a few ideas. There are certainly others that are powerful as well. And then communities are doing a lot of great things. So I have colleagues working in a couple of different states that are involved in projects like Maura and Judy. And really what they've told me is that the most important thing that communities can do is fund water quality monitoring and storm management projects. And so there are lots of volunteer monitors, and it's just not good enough anymore. We have too much to monitor, and too much to analyze, and too much data to assess in order to make decisions, and very little funding. And so really those individuals are advocating for that first, to fund more monitoring and to fund action related to community stormwater management. Again, getting out into neighborhoods and talking about what individuals can do, and then also on the back end, what towns can do to manage the water that's coming out before it hits our rivers, our harbors. And so they're coming up with some unique ways to do that, but it's the funding that we need to really plug in there. And so what other options do we have? And I wanted to circle back to how shellfish can contribute to cleaner waters. I talked earlier about their filtration capacity, but I also mentioned that populations have been reduced to the point where they may not be making a lot of impact. So the question is, how and when can they make a difference? They can, but there are lots of caveats and considerations. And when I attempted to show the video, but failed, of the shellfish in the tank, some of you would have been wowed, maybe people that haven't seen it before, and others would probably challenge me that, again, it's not that simple, and those people are right. We can't just throw a bunch of shellfish out there and expect that they're going to save the world and reduce all these nutrients and improve the water clarity. But I'm going to give you just 3 examples of how communities are utilizing shellfish as one tool in the toolbox. We can't forget that our wastewater treatment plants need to be upgraded. They need to have the best technology. We can't forget that people have septic systems and cesspools, and they need to be maintained. We can't forget that we have all these choked off coves, and maybe we need to improve the water flow. But maybe, just maybe, we could use shellfish again as one tool to remedy some of these water quality issues. And so I just wanted to point out a project in Cape Cod. There are a lot of leaking septic systems down there. Most of the Cape has been on septic systems, and it causes this unsightly nitrogen-induced algae blooms that happen in all of the ponds and the rivers there, most of them, and associated environmental impacts that I mentioned before. They can smother not only shellfish habitats, but all sorts of habitats and kill organisms or stress them to some degree. In addition to some other ideas that they talked about, what I just mentioned, the centralized wastewater treatment, septic system designs that are innovative, fertilizer reduction. They're talking about inlet widening for tidal flushing. They're considering shellfish growing and harvesting as one of their tools. And scientists from Woods Hole Sea Grant and Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution and Boston University are working to quantify how many oysters or clams they would have to grow in any particular area, depending on the size and the flow of the particular water body, to make a positive impact on water quality. So they're considering all of the other water quality remediation measures, and then shellfish and what shellfish can do, what part do they play. And the first step is to determine how much nitrogen an average oyster or clam takes from its environment and at different seasons throughout the year, and then assess what the whole population is, how many oysters or clams are in that system, and how many they need to restore to that system to actually make an impact. And so they're doing some great work out in Cape Cod, and local towns are actually incorporating shellfish into their strategies. So it's nice to see that there's science that's informing their management decisions. In a nearby project in Greenwich, Connecticut, NOAA scientists, as well as an economist from SUNY Stony Brook and the local Shellfish Commission, along with also industry partners, are working on a similar project. They're quantifying all of the shellfish in the town of Groton. So they're going out and conducting surveys in all of the town waters to figure out how many shellfish are there. They know the contribution of a single oyster and clam in terms of the nitrogen it will move. And they're trying to put a dollar value on the whole nitrogen removal potential of the shellfish in that town, which is pretty exciting. And it's exciting that they've built this partnership with industry as well. And then finally, a project that I just learned about a few months ago out of Maryland, a company called Blue Oyster Environmental, who has oyster farmers as partners, is working hand in hand with growers throughout their state to calculate and bundle what they're calling nutrient credits, which are typically traded among wastewater treatment plants. One has excess nutrients coming out of the plant, another might not have as many, and so one will trade with the other. In this case, they're bundling nutrient credits generated by an oyster grower based on the oyster harvest. So how many oysters they have in the system. And when they ultimately harvest those oysters, they're pulling the nitrogen in the form of the body tissue out of the system. So removing the nitrogen altogether. And those credits, which again are removing nitrogen and phosphorus pollution from the water, are certified through the state's regulatory agencies. And then this company, Blue Oyster Environmental, is selling those credits on behalf of the grower. They're finding these buyers that want to reduce their environmental footprint. And once the credits are sold, they're paying the oyster growers for the credits, who then use it to buy and plant more oysters. So sort of, paying it forward and increasing the benefit there. And so we don't know much about this project and how it's actually going to play out since it just started, but they do have some buyers, so that's exciting. And they're getting a lot of attention. So people are looking at this across the nation as, could this be a model for nutrient management? Again, and we don't want to take much needed funds away from the wastewater treatment plants and the upgrades that they will need in coming years. But this could be a potential alternative in addition to maintaining those plants. So these are just a few of the ways that communities are considering using shellfish as one tool to improve water quality. So that brings us to some takeaway messages. Shellfish as you've heard, are ecologically, economically, and culturally important, but their populations have been drastically reduced. And while aquaculture and recreational harvest are really important in growing our state, they are threatened by land use that introduces nutrients, mainly nitrogen, and pathogens, mainly bacteria, into those harvest areas. And it threatens closures, it threatens livelihoods. We can get sick, and beaches can be closed too for the same reasons, these high bacteria counts. But as I've mentioned, there's also good news. There are actions that we can take to reduce the impact that we have on our quality of the water around our house, what flows into our storm drains, what our communities can do on a higher level to take action, and now innovative ways that we can use shellfish as a way to improve water quality itself. And so with that, I just want to thank you for your attention tonight, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have, and just a few acknowledgements as well.
Thank you, Tessa. That was great. So does anyone have any questions for Tessa? I have one that's just kind of a general question. I was curious, you had mentioned that there are more oyster beds in the western part of the Sound than the eastern part of the Sound. Why is that? Is it just the geography, or?
Yes, the geography, the water, so in the eastern end of the Sound, we do have some natural oyster beds. We had some extensive oyster beds in time. We have a lot of saltwater input from the ocean here, and so our salinities are much higher, and oysters typically grow in lower salinities and reproduce well in lower salinities. That doesn't mean they won't grow here, but reproducing is a different thing. And so the habitat there was more suitable for oyster beds. And so we start to see some of our larger beds from the Quinnipiac, or the Houstonic, the Quinnipiac River, and west. We have beds in town and state waters, and I think it's about 7,000 acres in total.
Okay.
So those beds were also set aside. Superior Court designated those specific beds to support the aquaculture industry, and so just their significant size and importance.
Great. Anyone else?
I do have a question, Tessa. What do you think the major challenges are and opportunities of climate change on the shellfishing activities in Long Island Sound?
Shellfishing and climate change. Well,
warming waters, that sort of thing.
So, you know, I think rainfall is definitely an issue that the state is grappling with right now. And not this year. I mean, we went from a year with a lot of heavy rainfall and frequent storms to a drought year, but that has its own challenges. And so I think the fact that things are changing and are more extreme presents challenges for not only the shellfish resources, but shellfishing itself. So with more rainfall, Don, you're intimately familiar with this, we have more shellfish closures. But when we, would typically have an inch of rainfall or less, now we might see storms of 3 inches. And so how does that impact the runoff and how long we see, water, is it water flowing down our rivers and quicker out to sea, or is it staying within our harbors? And so that bacteria is in those shellfishing areas longer. These are all questions that the state's grappling with right now. And, as things change, how do we monitor the waters? And I know that they're looking at stream gauge data now. Dave Carey can probably talk a little bit more about that, in addition to just the rainfall data, to better understand those stream flows and how they have implications for shellfish harvest areas. And certainly with drought comes changes in salinity, little freshwater input, which may impact reproduction of oysters and other shellfish. And then I didn't talk anything about ocean acidification and coastal ocean acidification, but these are, again, questions that are really out there. And right now, scientists are in data collection mode. We don't know a lot, except these are certain threats.
Well, how about opportunities though? Warming waters, longer growing season, that sort of thing?
For sure, a longer growing season, faster growing shellfish. So for aquaculturists, they can get their product to the market sooner. I mean, we would definitely benefit from there because we compete with southern states that get their product to market in 2 years versus, we may have a 3 to 4 year window for our product. You have any thoughts on the topic?
No, you're doing very well, Tessa. I appreciate it.
Sure.
Hi, Tessa. This is Denise Savageau. I have a quick question on the funding in Maryland. I thought it was quite fascinating in terms of the potential for, utilizing a funding technique like that. And I was wondering if if anyone has brought that up. They're really having big discussions on that with the Governor's Council on Climate Change, and there's a whole task force looking at that. And do you know if this is being discussed more broadly within the state of Connecticut?
I think that the conversation in Connecticut is really focused on the wastewater treatment plants. And again, this is something that I would defer to David Carey. He's the director of our Bureau of Aquaculture, but really we have a lot of wastewater treatment plants along the coastline that are in need of upgrade, and certainly in areas a little bit further in the watershed. And it's really key. I mean, those are right in our shellfishing areas. And so if something happens with those, we're done. So, we can put as many oysters in the water as we want, but if we have wastewater treatment plants that are not up to snuff, we're really going to be suffering. So I think there's definitely been a conversation about it, but maybe no thought about how this would practically be implemented. Like, what sort of funding could we find for that? But there definitely seems to be a lot of potential. Thanks for your question. I don't know if Dave, you want to say anything about that? He's on the line tonight.
I don't know how to do this. I think I may be on here.
You are, we can hear you, yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you, Krista. I think it was a great presentation. Okay, I'd really like to know more about municipality participation in these programs, and what you are asking from different municipalities in respect to wastewater runoff, lawn runoff, and the rest of it. Thank you.
Not sure I understand your question, but let me try.
Okay.
Let me take a stab at it. I think, what I'm doing is providing you with some observations I've made of some communities that have started to take some forward progress in terms of identifying actions that will help remediate the water quality challenges. But I really, would want to put the focus on groups like Judy's and Maura's that are looking at specific watershed impairments, and the power that they have is in the groups that they pull together. And so they're relying on scientists and managers at the state level within Connecticut DEP and at times within the Connecticut Bureau of Aquaculture to better understand the water quality impairments and challenges. And then they look to local officials and local stakeholders to really understand what's happening locally and people who have lived in the community and who have seen the changes. And I think that that's that's their strength is using those local people. But it's really, I think the change comes when they're able to identify the funding and the long-term monitoring. That's really important. So I think what you're asking is what am I suggesting that communities do? And I think it's, it's really these people like Maura and Judy that pull these groups together and start tackling the problems, and then identifying the potential funding sources to implement changes little by little, or if fix problems. In the town of Groton, the Shellfish Commission years ago, I think, was working with, it might have been Judy and her group, but there was a bacteria problem. The shellfishing area had to be closed. They were able to track down and find that there was a leaking pipe and repair, not repair, but first find funding and then later repair this infrastructure. And having these sort of groups to, be motivated enough to address the problem, to understand and to address the problem, it is really key. So I think that it's forming these partnerships that needs to happen in order for all those next steps to happen. So just kudos to that group. And did I answer everything that you were looking for?
I think you said the big deal is partnerships.
Yes,
Yes.
for sure.
Thank you, Chris. It was a beautiful presentation.
Thank you.
Hey, Tessa, Dick Conant, I might just add, from a regulatory standpoint, most of the big towns, Groton being one of them in Connecticut, are under MS4 stormwater permits that requires the town to go out, clean out, storm drain, catch basins, institute best management practices, erosion control, all that. So, and that's of course administered by the DEP. It may not apply to small towns like Griswold, but even a small town would be under, I would think their town government would be under best management practices, either self-imposed or imposed upon them from the state level.
Absolutely. And it's trying to get out to those areas more regularly. We just can't do it quickly enough. And I think it's, we need to get beyond just what the town can do, but really encourage communities and individuals within communities to take action. I think it's really important because, again, partnerships are important, but if we rely on the few people like you, Dick, and Don Murphy, and those people who are very passionate, I think it takes a broader community to really understand the issue and bring it to the highest level so that people, everybody cares, or the majority of people care, our children care. And so I think that, people need to see their neighbors in the street. I want my kids to see the neighbor in the street, not only picking up their dog waste, but if they see a paper cup, or a bag that's near the storm drain, pick it up. Not because it's theirs, but because it's the right thing. So absolutely, it's definitely, there are rules and regulations, and then there's so much more that I want to encourage people to think about. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Krista.
Time for one more.
Sure.
Narrow question. I'm interested in improving shellfish populations in the lower Pawcatuck. And I don't know what outlets there are, what groups might be interested in that topic.
Okay, so there are several groups that you probably want to communicate with. There is the local Shellfish Commission in Stonington. Did you say the Pawcatuck River?
Yeah.
The Little Narragansett Bay. Okay.
I know it's restricted, but I just, in general, interested in the populations.
So just, the people that you want to talk about that deal with shellfish in the area are the local Shellfish Commission in Stonington. So Don Murphy's on this call. Dave Prescott from Save the Bay. So that's a nonprofit, and they're working to better understand the water quality, monitoring shellfish in the area. There are a couple of state agencies in Rhode Island, and we can talk about that offline, but Department of Environmental Management and the Rhode Island Coastal Management Council
Great.
that are involved. So a bunch of different stakeholders that you'd want to talk to understand what's already happening in the area, and maybe be part of the data collection.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for being on the call.
All right, do we have any more questions for Tessa? All right, if not, then I'm going to go ahead and wrap things up. So I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. That was an absolutely fantastic presentation. Thank you so much, Tessa. A lot of really, really great information there for us all to digest. So I just want to remind you that we have 2 more programs this month on Wednesday evenings. Next week is, of course, septic system maintenance. And then we will have, on the 5th Wednesday of the month, we'll be having a presentation by Judy Preston on some of those homeowner management practices that folks can take